Okay, my good sir, as usual, the one and only Mr. William Gairdner, thank you very much for joining us. It's a huge pleasure, and we are always honored to have you. And today you're going to speak about democracy against the family. So the stage is yours, and thank you.
Thank you, Ari, and once again, thank you for having me on this show. I feel very honored to be part of your group and to share my thoughts. Okay, I want to say right now, at this very moment, that even when I heard you speak the title of this talk, I felt that little sort of shock that I think a lot of people who've grown up with the idea that democracy is the very best political system ever invented feel when I say that my paper is on democracy against the family. What? What are you talking about? How can that be so? And they immediately get quite rattled and unsettled. And I must say the room goes very quiet because they want to hear this analysis. And I'm not going to say I'm the first one to ever come up with it, but I haven't heard it elsewhere, although I have read lots of interesting, books and essays on the threat to the family posed by the egalitarian state. What I'm going to be talking about here is how democracy itself has been transformed from, let's call it, a political institution of which we were all about which we've all been pretty enthusiastic for the last, couple hundred years in the Western world, into its modern condition, which, as I say, I think is destructive of family bonds. And in fact, I should mention here that if you're willing to have me again next week, I'd like to speak on the topic of how it is that the egalitarian state is destructive of human social bonding. So if we could think about that as a title for next week's talk, it's very important to understand exactly how an institution that we call democracy has been undermining Western society. The first time I got, and anyway, I'm basically reading my paper again, which I delivered to the World Congress of Families in 1997 in Geneva, Switzerland. And again, not to be self-important, but the room went pretty quiet when I started this paper, and they stayed quiet till the very end. And I think they were in a bit of shock and trying to digest the message here because it constituted an insult to their core beliefs. Not that I was trying to be insulting, but the analysis they found deeply unsettling. So let me get started. As I say, I'm going to read this paper because I can't say it any better than I wrote it. And I will interject periodically, like I'm doing right now, to give a little more flavor and background to the topic. So anyway, the first time I got deeply alarmed about the status of the family in modern society was when I heard an important politician, when he was asked, what is the family? What's the definition of the family? He said the family should be, I'm quoting, any four people seen together on Donahue, unquote. Now, Donahue at the time was a very popular television show, and it was basically about families, plural. And so this guy's definition of the family was any four people that you might happen to see on Donahue at any time. And of course, that got a big laugh. But what disturbed me deeply was that so many of the people in his audience thought this was just great. On their minds was the notion that we should all be free to live as we please. And they said, I'm quoting again, that's what democracy is all about, isn't it? Unquote. I mean, you could hear them thinking and saying these things. We should all be free to live as we please. In other words, they were dismissing the notion that the family itself had any sort of definitional foundation. So anyway, I decided to fight back when I heard that. In my book, The War Against the Family, which we have discussed lots on this show, was the result. By the end of it, what seemed manifestly clear to me is that throughout history, the state and the private family wax and wane inversely to each other. Now, the first person I read, and I recommend it to all of you on this topic, was Robert Nisbet, an American sociologist who's not with us any longer. But he wrote a fabulous book called The Quest for Community. Again, The Quest for Community. And the notion behind his book was that, we're striving to make communities. It's a quest. How do we go about it, and what happens to it once we've got it done? And he traces the, let's call it the animosity, the conflict between the state and the family, the community we call the family, from ancient times to the present. His observations on ancient Rome and Athens and on the Middle Ages, right up to modernity, are quite eye-opening, and I dare say I learned a lot from him, and I think that you will too. At any rate, as I say, what I have learned is that the state and the private family wax and wane inversely to each other. Again, that shocked my audience. They all knew that the states has gotten bigger over time. That means the importance of the family must have gotten smaller. And yet, I myself had always thought that what we fondly term democracy should be an exception to this rule. But now I think it is not. The rise of enthusiastic so-called right-wing populism, or pure democracy for conservatives, that I have sometimes pushed hard myself in an effort to push back the social engineering of my own country, Canada, and which I think is in fact an important tool for beating back big government. It seems to me now as somewhat of a Trojan horse when it comes to society and the family. In order to understand the larger conflict, however, we need first to understand the smaller ones within the larger conflict. First, we have an ongoing struggle between the organic and the radical view of the status, or let's call it the position of society vis-a-vis the state. In the classical Athenian forms of democracy, and even in the early democracies of the New World, society, and especially, by that I mean civil society, and especially the family, was always held to be at the center of life. And a producer, or rather an absolute origin, both of the individual, who was always considered less important than society, and of government, at best considered a kind of delegated defender of the mostly unwritten social constitution. This was an organic concept that said the individual is naturally obedient by law to government and by convention and morality to society. And now there's all kinds of interesting works like Carcopino's little book called A Day in the Life of Ancient Rome, in which you can see this kind of thing taking place. There was a lot of civil authority at the time, which was distinct from government. It arose out of the common moral convictions of the people. And of course, this is what modern democracy has been pushing against all too vigorously, especially since John Stuart Mill wrote his classic little work called On Liberty, in which he conflated let's call it the oppressions of big government with the oppressions of society itself. In other words, he equated the two as unwelcome authority and defended only the individual choosing, the choosing of individuals. With few exceptions, however, organic democracies seem to transform over time into their radical form, and rarely the other way. We need to ask why this is so, and really, why is it so? For when they have huge, I'm now trying to explain, when they have huge tax harvests to spend, they may do this, they may transform. I actually would rather use the word mutate now. They may mutate with amazing speed because, transforming and evolving, those words imply a little bit of progress, whereas mutation doesn't. You can mutate in any direction. And I think our societies have mutated. Now, for when they have huge tax harvests to spend, they may do this with amazing speed. Canada and Sweden are examples. And we have talked on this show about Sweden and its role in the destruction of the natural family and its efforts to, very successful efforts really, to convert a traditional-based society of Sweden into a radical socialist nation. They flip-flopped a bit from time to time since then, but basically that was the major mutation. And of course, in Canada, it happened basically with under Pierre Trudeau, who basically turned Canada from its traditional anchoring and very conservative moral values into a much more socially radical, libertarian state. In fact, if you don't mind the digression, I refer to our former Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, as a living example of what I have come to call a libertarian socialist. Now, this is someone who fights aggressively for the idea that as individuals, we all have a lot of libertarian personal and sexual rights. For example, rights to drugs, rights to any kind of sex that we want, rights to easy divorce. It's nonstop. But when it comes to the state itself and whatever government thinks it can provide, get this equally for everybody, then we are in harness to the government, and a lot of taxes are taken from us to make sure that, in Canada's case, because we're bounded by two oceans, from coast to coast, we have the same socialist services for all citizens. So there we have libertarian socialism, you see, where the contradiction into which the West has driven itself by leaving its original foundation in liberty and fastening onto a new foundation in forced equality. Get that? It's forced equality. It's not equality per se. Our original foundation in liberty implied equality before the law and in the eyes of God. But that was all. It didn't imply any equality of outcomes, which of course have to be forced. Because in order to give Paul the outcomes that he doesn't have, you have to first take them from Peter and give them to him. So that requires force, a massive force of egalitarian states. But that's what Trudeau was a living example of this himself. He was Canada's first ever public libertarian socialist. And now I would say all Canadians accept that idea of the good life. And they behave as libertarians in their private and in their sexual lives. And you can see this in their pushback attitudes, such as, don't lecture me, sort of thing, or who are you to say? They're repudiating all notions of public morality, the pressures of civil society to control them from doing things which most people might consider perverse. But they get out from under by claiming libertarian individual and sexual rights. And they accept, like docile sheep, the forced equality of the state at the same time. And this, as I say, is how modern democracies have resolved their own contradiction, the contradiction they brought upon themselves. So what I'm talking to you about today is how that came about. So let me get back to my little paper after discussing Canada and Sweden. Both of these countries traveled from deeply conservative to extremely radical in less than half a century. That's not long. For both of them, civil society, which is rooted in the natural family, has been dislodged. And we end up with a tripartite structure with the provider state at the top as our master, rarely even pretending to obey the will of the people, and civil society, and the family, which is at the heart of civil society, in the middle, as a repositioned servant to this provider, and millions of isolated individuals as recipients of equal rights and benefits that are dished out by the state at the top. So that's the tripartite structure, or what I call, excuse the term, the political sandwich that we're living with today. It bears noting that even though this repositioning was restrained by classical liberal beliefs and by the strength of religion for quite some time, arguably until this century, the autonomism and subsequent atomization of society that has resulted was fully intended, and it has been carried out in the West under the flag of democracy. Very interesting why democracy should set that as its task. So this first unresolved conflict takes the form of a question. Which shall be first, the individual or civil society? I suggest that many conservative thinkers today are not sure. They don't know what to say because they are living examples of the libertarian socialist, which is basically both at the same time. And that's how they've resolved the contradiction within themselves. So there are many people running around Canada today, and I'm sure many European nations, who call themselves conservative, but what they really mean is they want smaller government. I mean, who doesn't, right? And they want lower taxes. I mean, who doesn't? That's pretty simple. But when it comes to asking them about the kinds of egalitarian social policies which have arisen and forced themselves upon the people, and why aren't they fighting against those? We like socialized medical care. Why should the money in a man's pocket dictate what kind of medical care that he gets? Well, you counter that that idea, which is everywhere in Canada today. Whenever the newspaper tells us that our system is failing again, they've been writing these kinds of editorials for 40 years about the failure of socialized medicine and how we have to do something about it. But the last thing they want to do is throw it overboard and free Canadian citizens to buy whatever health care that they want. And then, of course, subsidize, let the government pay for the truly needy who can't afford it. But when the guy says, why should the money in your pocket dictate the kind of medical care you get? I look at him, he's wearing nice shoes, drives a nice car, and I say, well, why should it dictate the kind of car you get to buy, or the kind of watch you're wearing, or the kind of meal you're eating with me right now? And they don't know what to say because they're not going to give that up, So anyway, these contradictions are deeply cemented into the nature of modern societies, which simply are not facing these contradictions. And that's what I've been trying to do in things like this paper. It bears noting that even though this repositioning was restrained by classical liberal beliefs and by the strength of religion for quite some time, arguably until this century, as I say, I'm repeating myself here, the autonomism and the subsequent atomization of society that has resulted was fully intended and has been carried out in the West under the flag of democracy. So this first unresolved conflict takes the form of the question, which shall be first, the individual or a society? It's worth repeating the question. Flowing from this is a second conflict between the hierarchical and egalitarian views of moral authority. The first says that the moral orderings of society flow from some high standard of the good and of right behavior, downward by degrees to lower forms. Standards of any kind, however, automatically create moral authority backed by stigma and shame, and above all, they emphasize not the equality of persons and their behavior, but their differences. We are told this is not in the democratic spirit, that we should not speak of moral standards, we should speak only of values, because values are freely chosen by individuals, whereas moral standards are imposed by the larger society. Between you and me, I can't see how any human society has ever survived without living under some kind of system of imposed moral values, which all citizens either overtly or implicit, to which all citizens either overtly or implicitly agree. And that's how daily life is possible. This goes down to even the smallest things like ordinary manners. Like the fellow who stands up for a woman on the bus. Maybe that's passé these days. I don't know. It's a reflex. He does it because it's been accepted all his life. He was told to do it by his mom and dad, and he's done it all his life. He doesn't think about it. And there are thousands of things, saying thank you, please. And we teach our children very early. No, you can't have it until you say please. And then when they take it, you wait. And if they're still quiet, you say thank you. They look at you. I said, so you say thank you after someone is nice to you. And then they say thank you. And they incorporate these unconscious values. So I don't buy for a minute the idea that any society can go on for long without an entire intricate system of overt as well as implicit moral standards under which the people live. Now, I think of all of this, say, over a nation as a kind of bubble. You can imagine a kind of bubble covering the whole nation, and we're all walking around sharing these standards when we don't even know that we're sharing them. We just do it just like we speak our natural language. Most people who speak English, which is my first language, but it's true for any language, they don't know anything about the grammar of the language. They don't know how the language is made. They don't know about its linguistic structure or any of those things. And it's interesting because they don't have to. You can be the most beautiful speaker or writer of any language in the world without knowing the first thing about the unconscious linguistic structure of that language. But the same is true with manners in a moral society. You don't have to know how it got there or why it is so, but you do have to speak the moral language, and you are really not free to change the moral structure of civil society any more than you're free to change your language. And if you try to do that, people are going to look at you like you're really weird, so you don't do it because subconsciously that it can't be done. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that moral standards can be overt, explicit, and expressed, which they often are, but lots of it is kind of unconscious. So the logic of democracy now says that because all values are chosen, that word, by people with equal worth and rights, therefore all values are equal. And to insist otherwise is to, another favorite word of the left, is to impose your values on mine. However, neither the family nor society as a whole can survive as moral communities without the positive discriminations and the stigma and the shame, actually, that are required to defend the good. Shame, by the way, is a word you don't even hear nowadays. It's as if people are ashamed of shaming people for being bad, even their own children. You see it all around you. I go to a hockey arena in Canada to watch my kids play hockey, and some kid is running around using the most foul language. You better believe I'm going to shame him into stopping it. He turns red in the face and apologizes and he stops. But shame was part of that. And I'm just adding a note here to say that shame seems to have disappeared from our society as if it's an irrelevant social tool, which is required for what I call social bonding. So the liberal meaning of tolerance, for example, is not in itself a good. It is a declaration that everything is good. Therefore, nothing is bad. So as democracy travels at increasing speed from organic to radical, virtue must fall. And then the state leaps eagerly into this moral vacuum. Human rights tribunals, such as we have in Canada, you probably have them in Israel too, are just one example of this. And so the question, shall we have family at the center of a good society, hangs on our prior decision whether to argue for standards or merely values, and policy follows accordingly. Flowing from this is a third conflict between opposing visions of the self that underlie modern times. Now, I call these the metaphors of the glass house and the onion. The first imagines each of us enclosed in a structure made of hundreds of panes of glass, of opaque glass. You can't see through it. In this vision, the truth of the universe is external, and each time we achieve an insight into the truth, one of those panes of glass breaks, allowing a fuller glimpse of the world beyond, of the truth beyond. The goal of our earthly life is to improve one's own character by breaking as many panes as possible before the end, when all should be as clear as possible in your life. The contrary onion metaphor, however, says that because everything is a matter of relative values, ultimate truth must be internal. And thus, if we will just peel back enough layers of the false authority that is laid down by society, religion, family, and so on, we will find our true selves shining and beautiful. Now, the image of this self, as trapped by the falseness of the material and moral world, is profoundly rooted in the West. And some of your listeners may remember in my lecture on Gnosticism, I pointed to this as one of the key realities of the Gnostic religion, is this idea that truth is internal to the self. At any rate, it's deeply rooted. It's also deeply anti-authoritarian, and it's crucial to the success of the democratic enterprise. The prototypical modern voice broke through long ago in America in the poet Walt Whitman's essay called Democratic Vistas. Get the title of his series of poems, Democratic Vistas. And in 1805, another poem he wrote called Leaves of Grass, which begins with the words, "Of oneself I sing, a simple, separate person," unquote. That was the opening line. He's basically telling the reader that he's going to tell you about himself, and he's a simple, separate person, not necessarily part of your community or the world that you live in. And another poem that he wrote, wouldn't you know, was called Song of Myself, which begins, I'm quoting, "I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you," period. I'm not quite sure what the last line meant, that every atom that belongs to you belongs to me. But you can see what he was getting at. He was the radical atomization of the molecule that we think of as the family and our civil society. And now you can use that physical or chemical metaphor because it rings true. We have tended all for centuries and centuries to live as social molecules bonded to each other, which is why I call it social bonding. And that's how we think of ourselves, plural. But in atomization, the molecule is broken and the atoms float free. They're not bonded to anything. You might even say they're not even bonded to themselves. They're just what they are, and every atom, as Walt Whitman said, this was long before anyone had ever actually seen an atom, but I guess he picked that word up from the ancient philosophers like Democritus, who did suppose that the universe was made of atoms. And everyone belongs to me as it belongs to you. For democratic Walt, the self is sovereign in the moral realm. There is no higher law. Just as in democratic theory, the collection of selves is sovereign, based on the old slogan, Vox Populi, Vox Dei, which means the voice of the people is the voice of God. Again, I use the word collection of selves. You see, it's not a community of selves, it's just a collection of selves. And it's the root of that Latin slogan was at the root of emerging democratic theory in the 17th century in England, where the radicals who formed part of the New Model Army, which fought the king for the creation of a new constitution, they used that phrase, Vox Populi, Vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. Wow. And the soldiers in the army, and I mentioned this before, but it astonishes me to say it each time, They actually got together and had meetings, and they went to the generals and they said, we're going to make military plans. You're going to take orders from us, from we the people. We'll give you the orders. Well, it didn't work, or if they tried it, it didn't work for very long because they got beaten by the king's army at that point. But any rate, they soon realized that authority requires structure. It requires hierarchy, and the most gifted at whatever it is they're doing are at the top, and the orders flow down to the bottom for the implementation. It doesn't matter whether it's a corporation, a school, a university, a government, or a ship that you're on. Imagine the guy down in the ship's engine room coming up on deck and telling the captain he's going to take over. First thing the captain might say is, well, why are you in the engine room if you know enough to just navigate this ship? But of course, everybody knows he doesn't know how to do it. So it's bizarre. It's bizarre for people at the bottom of the perpendicular structure of any authority to start talking like they should be running the ship. But think about it. Isn't that what happens in popular democracies? The people themselves decide that they should be running things. And this gets us into all kinds of theoretical difficulties, which I can explain another time. Well, perhaps I already have explained some of them. And it shocks people when I say that probably the greatest weakness of all democratic theory, whether ancient democracies or modern, is that the vote of a fool cancels the vote of a wise man. And because there are so many more fools than there are wise men, then democracy has to go down. You can see that the more democracy that you do, the lower it's going to go. It's going to be low. It's going to be a lowering society instead of a raising society. It won't be taking itself upwards towards higher standards, a higher sense of moral obligation and duty and virtue and flourishing and all that. No, it'll be going down because each of those individuals who's canceling the vote of the wise man or woman who might have helped sort the society out is taking over. It's the greatest weakness of all democracies, no matter when they occurred. And that's why the ancients used to say they never last for very long. The Greek democracy lasted 175 years, possibly. It was interrupted on a couple of occasions because they voted to end it. And then things got even worse under their whatever dictator. So they voted to bring it back again, and it got worse again. Why human beings have so much trouble regulating themselves in their own societies, I don't know. But it's clear that they do. And, our own Churchill said that democracy was the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried from time to time. That's kind of a backhanded compliment to a system which is far from perfect. And, of course, must be watched very carefully lest it go astray. My theory in the inside of the heart of this paper is that our modern democracy has gone astray by taking the direction it has taken. In modern times, we encounter everywhere the same shrill claim of a right to seek out and fulfill one's personal appetites, get this, as prior to other social obligations or conventions. This amounts to what I call the descent of sovereignty over time. It's part of it. First, democratic thinkers attacked the sovereignty of God. And then they attacked the sovereignty of kings, what they used to call the absolute authority of kings. And then they attacked the authority of aristocrats. And now finally, and ironically, we see the people themselves being attacked in the name of individuals and their rights. In other words, democratic ideology seems to end by attacking the very society it nurtured in its organic stage. Conservatives will not be able to restore civil society until they restore a more realistic concept of the self and its obligations. And I have to tell you, it's shocking to me that documents like Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which Trudeau Sr. created with some help from other politicians, does not include the word obligations anywhere. It's not in the document. In the German Civil Code, by the way, it is in their charter. I forget the name of the actual charter. It's called the German Basic Law.
William,
yeah.
If I may ask, which obligations do you think are necessary to restrain and become a base for a healthy society?
Well, the first one I would say in a democratic system would be to train citizens to think about the good of all before their own good. That's hard to do. Most people are selfish, self-centered. All they want is their own good. So they figure if they throw a vote into the ring to get what they personally want, and they don't care what anybody else wants or whether it's good for anybody else or not, you're talking again about a collection and not a community. I think we've lost the idea, which certainly was prevalent in the early centuries in North America. I don't know about your country, but when democracy was discussed, and they were so suspicious of it as a governmental system at the founding of America and Canada, they all agreed that the common good was what mattered, not just the individual good, that out of the common good would come individual good, shaped by the common good. But the individual should not be shaping things according to his own personal predilections and or perversities. So you see, that emphasis is the only thing that allowed the American founders to think of themselves as including democracy in their system. Other than that, I have to say, and I've read a little bit about them enough to know that they were all highly suspicious of democratic systems. And in the little book they wrote called The Federalist Papers, which is a must-read for anybody who's into political theory, not just Americans, it's a very instructive document, an exchange of newspaper articles originally on the whole theory of democratic government and the good and the bad of it, and very much worth reading. Their whole idea was that because of what I said, that the vote of a fool cancels the vote of a wise man. They knew that. They grew up learning that, and they knew about the disaster of Greek democracy. They knew about the disaster of democracy in Rome and in the medieval Italian states. All the corruption and the skullduggery and the murder that was, in Rome. I mean, the people raiding the Senate, killing 300 senators and throwing them all in the Tiber River, that kind of stuff. That's not really how civilized people should be solving their problems. But these things happen. So the Americans were highly suspicious of democracy as a political system. And that's why they developed their checks and balances to offset those differences so that no one branch of government, of the three branches of government, would call the shots without the possibility of being checked by the other branches.
But as you can see, it's not working well. And you used the term to train the people for the common good. If you have like a predatory kind of rulers, and they can have this training, how to say it, like training camps, then they can take advantage of the weaker people, those who are not as smart as you mentioned earlier. And then you get the common good to be a collectivist state of mind, which will eventually lead to the atrocities that we see. So how do you stop it?
And we've seen enough of that, haven't we? Well,
yes.
you have to bring back Aristotelian notions about the flourishing of citizens and of the polis, of the cities and our communities. No one talks about that anymore. In fact, I wrote an article I recommend to you. Maybe I'll send it to you. It's called Democracy and the Anti-Polis. It's about the reason, and this is shocking too, that one of the great attractions of big cities, and that's what we're seeing is bigger and bigger and bigger cities. Good heavens, I competed in the Pan American Games in Sao Paulo, Brazil in 1963, which is like the Dark Ages. The city was 5 million, and we thought it was huge. 5 million, my goodness, Now it's something like 22 million. It's enormous. Look at Cairo, 23 million citizens. Everywhere we look, the people are crowding into these urban centers. And I submit and I can be proven wrong, I'm sure, if somebody comes up with a good argument, but I haven't yet. I submit that one of the underlying unspoken and unconscious reasons that modern cities have proved so popular is because they have become not a polis, in the ideal of the Greek philosophers, but the anti-polis, places where you don't have to worry about morality. You don't have to worry about your personal conduct. I mean, okay, breaking the law, getting picked up by the police, fine. But in your private life, you don't have to worry about anything. You can do whatever the hell you want. And it's encouraged. You don't even know your neighbors. Like somebody on the other side of the wall, you may hear them playing their music. You may even hear them doing all kinds of things. I don't know. But you don't have to meet them. You don't have to know them. If you don't know your neighbors, you don't have any neighbors. And I think the modern city is incredibly attractive to all kinds of people because they can escape the moral oversight which they felt in their small villages and their small towns where everybody knew everybody. When Sally speaks to Susie over the backyard fence, when they're both hanging out their laundry, they're making up moral rules for their children. They're saying, my kid is only 8 years old and he wants to go to the movies with his friends. Do you let your kid do that? And Susie gets to say, no way. And suddenly they both agree they're going to tell their children the same thing. So we have a moral bond here, a community bond, and that just replicates throughout society. So if you're asking me, is it possible, for example, for dictators to forcibly take over entire societies, even with democratic means, and run them autocratically and then in a totalitarian way? I'd say, of course it is. That's what Hitler did. That's what so many of the Marxist regimes have done. And then we get these one-party states where people do not get a choice of opposing parties. They lose their freedoms and that kind of thing. Well, you'd have to say that individual freedom is important to living a moral life, because you can't choose to be good if you can't choose anything at all. You can't even choose evil. You're just an automaton. I don't know if I've responded to your question at all, but
yes,
I've been trying to explain that this descent of sovereignty over time has landed us in the sovereignty of the people and individual rights. And I think it's led to the problems I'm trying to discuss here. So attacking the very society that democratic ideology nurtured in the first place in its organic stage. And as conservatives, maybe this is partly to answer your question, will not be able to restore society until they restore a more realistic concept of the self and its obligations. The last and perhaps most important conflict has to do with the notion of privilege and exclusivity. Now, the very word privilege implies, it's a hated word today with wokeness, It implies ranking, hierarchy, and an insider-outsider, or what some call the friend-enemy distinction, which is repugnant to all democratic thinking. And yet I believe that the underlying mechanism for the formation of any human community, from the intimacy of the biological family to the nation itself, considered as a political family, is this very distinction. This means, and this is my most subversive point, that the democratic impulse is in the long run inherently contrary to the impulse for community. The reason for this is that all social groups seem to rely on a 4-step process to recruit and bind their members as insiders. What I'm going to explain to you here, I don't want to claim originality for it, but I've never heard it from anyone else. And I can actually remember the moment this analysis came to me like it fell from heaven. I was sitting in a parking lot somewhere waiting for my wife, who was at a meeting, and I was thinking about this deeply, and it just fell into my poor little brain, this notion, this analysis of social bonding, as I call it, which I'm going to explain to you right now, like how it works and why it leads to privilege and why that leads to problems in a democratic society. So I'll say again, the reason for this is that all social groups seem to rely on a 4-step process to recruit and bind their members as insiders. They require a willingness of members to sacrifice their self-interest to the group. Now, for example, there's an organization called Rotary International. You probably have it in Israel, I don't know, but we have it all over North America. And their motto is, quote, service above self, unquote. And organizations like this, and this goes for the family too, goes for any social organization, they require subordination. That's the second feature. You see, first, sacrifice of the self to the group, and then subordination to the authority and the rules of the group, and then they demand some process or ceremony of commitment. Think of a marriage. Think of what you do at a marriage ceremony, whereby a solemn vow, a contract, or a ritual is undertaken. And finally, when all this is done, they reserve privileges and a special status for accepted members that must be denied to all outsiders. That's a very radical paragraph I just read you, but I think it explains the inside notion of how social groups are formed and how they get to the insider-outsider distinction and the notion of privilege, which you can tell is anathema in an egalitarian society. Just the word privilege. We've been breaking that concept down for decades now. And today, under the woke regime of this religion what they call wokeness, I mean, it's everywhere. Privilege is a dirty word now. And if you get rid of it, you're getting rid of the bonding of the civil society itself. This means that when democracies move from their organic to their final, I'm calling it their final radical form, there will always be a civil war over moral standards due to democracy's imperative to eliminate all privilege, of which the natural family is historically the most glaring and persistent example. That's got to sink in. Of interest is that faced with two such conflicting ideals deeply held by the people, the ploy of the state has been to remove the offending privileged status of the family, but not its benefits. So, for example, homosexual couples and common law couples and all that kind of stuff who do not commit to procreative marriage. In some cases, they just can't because they can't procreate. They want the benefits anyway. And the way they get the benefits is by claiming that marriage, traditional heterosexual marriage, has no special status, and therefore the benefits should be showered upon anyone who wants them. These are simply showered on all claimants alike, thus converting formerly exclusive policies that secured a commitment from citizens to the family and to society into general welfare rights that release them from and dissolve those very commitments. Such democratic fundamentalism, as I call it, operates chiefly through 5 radical movements, each of which is aimed at the destruction of one kind of order or another crucial to the survival of the natural family. These are so well known, I need only mention them briefly. Radical feminism seeks to overthrow the biological order by negating all gender differences and the natural, social, and familial consequences that arise from these. I first wrote those words in 1997, and look what we have around us today. Even in 97, the most radical feminists you could find, who were writing all the radical feminist textbooks and essays and so on, this is before the internet, right, often said, if you want to be a true feminist, you have to be Marxist and you have to be a lesbian. Because in being a lesbian, you are protesting the whole idea of the heterogeneous natural family. The radical abortion movement connected to this seeks to overthrow the order of love and replace it with an order of death, whose natural extension is euthanasia. Knowing full well that without the right to kill their unborn children, women may be trapped, get the word, the Gnostic word, trapped by their bodies or by their gender in motherhood, which means trapped in the natural family, or in the case of euthanasia, trapped by their aging parents for whom they're getting tired of looking after. Section 7 of Canada's Charter, just to give one example, has supplied this right to them, the abortion right, under the aegis of something called, quote, security of the person, unquote, with no mention at all of the security of society or its future. The radical pansexual, homosexual, incest, and pornography movements, they're all kind of part of the same movement, seeks to overthrow the sexual order of society. They say that if the self is naturally good, then all sexuality is naturally good. However, our sexual order is grounded in 4 traditional prohibitions. And this is my analysis too. I don't really want to claim originality for it, but I've never seen it anywhere else. These traditional prohibitions are based on number, gender, age, and incest. We say you can only marry one person at a time, only someone of the opposite gender, never someone beneath a certain age, and not a close blood relative. All 4 of these measures were designed and inherited by us as a protection for a procreative society. And you notice that the homosexual movement and many other related movements have made it their objective to break down the sexual order by attacking every one of those concepts. What's wrong with polyamory? Why should number be a condition of marriage? Polyamory, I should love as many women as I want, and we'll all get married. What the hell, you know? Gender, that was gone, I mean, before the turn of the century with the idea of gay marriage. Of course, to me, that whole thing is a joke. I mean, if they want to clamor after social privileges like other people have because they're somehow a unit, they can do that if they want. But let's call it something besides
William,
the marriage.
I think you will be pleased to know, I just read it today, that in Germany, now you can change your sex legally every year. Every year. That's incredible, right?
Well, it actually qualifies as high comedy. Age, by the way, is also being attacked. It's one of the 4 prohibitions I had talked about. Age has been attacked for 50 years now. There's a group in New York called NAMBLA, which means the North American Man-Boy, so Man-Boy Love Association. You can look it up. It's on the web. I don't know. They brag about having 8,000 or 10,000 members. It's all for so-called intergenerational sex. They think sex with children should be allowed. So they're attacking the age prohibition. And one of their slogans, which I picked up from their website, maybe they dropped it since, I don't know, is called Sex Before 8, or else it's too late. Meaning if you want to convert a young boy to be a homosexual, you have to seduce him before he's 8 years old, and then he'll swing your way. And of course, what was I saying? Again, leaning almost exclusively on the democratic language of rights found in Canada's Charter, the privileges and protections normally reserved exclusively for those who commit themselves to this sexual order are now being given to all claimants regardless of qualification. So this is the egalitarian democratic thrust. And I've argued before that in the 4 stages of liberalism, that by the time democracy got to the 4th stage, it had a contradiction that had to be resolved. And the way it resolved it was by getting rid of these kinds of qualifications for government rights and benefits and so on. The most amusing and yet effective use of democratic political language is the push to legalize pedophilia on the grounds that it will, quote, liberate children from a, quote, sex-negative society, unquote. You can find that terminology in pedophilia websites, which are terrible places to go to, but when you're writing books, you have to do it if you want to argue against them. Not least, of course, we have the legal radicals who populate every law school in North America, sit on many benches, and have been very successful in eliminating the legal and tax order, which was originally constitutive of a family-based society, in the name, again, of purely democratic rights and demands for those rights. Until very recently, cohabitation has had amazing legal and tax advantages over true marriage, which was penalized by the tax code. Traditional family has been penalized under Canada's tax code. You know, families that wish to rear their own children. This whole thing, which got a real push going in Sweden to get the women out of the house and into the workforce, where they can create income, which is taxable, to support egalitarian benefits for everybody. You know, so one of the ways they did that was to make it difficult to raise your own, financially, to raise your own kids at home. Welfare rights financially reward single motherhood. America had a program called AFDC, which meant Aid to Families with Dependent Children. It was primarily invented to help poor Black women who got pregnant and had to raise their own kid, couldn't afford daycare, were trapped in their house, that's the language they used, and needed help. So the AFDC program said, well, we'll give you whatever it is, I'm picking a number here, but $500 a month to help you raise your child. Oh, thank you to the government. Bow down, you know. And then the government said, but there's one condition of this grant, this AFDC grant, is that if you have a man living with you in the house, the grant stops. Or if you get married, the grant stops. So the award, the policy was designed to help her support her child, and it ended if she decided to become a responsible woman and get married and try to create a family. So what did the women do? It's just smart. Well, I better have another child. If I have another child, I get $1,000 a month. If I have 3 children, I get $1,500 and so on. Back in the 60s, that was a lot of money. So the AFDC program is one of the egalitarian, democratic rights programs which came into being and was instrumental in the breakdown of the Black family. Charles Murray, in a wonderful book called Losing Ground, told us that the Black family was about, I'm picking a number, but I'm close, 85% intact in the 50s. There was a mother and the father in 85% of all Black homes. Today, I think it's something like 15 or 20%. Like the Black family has been decimated by these type of egalitarian programs, which you only find happening or being created in democratic societies of an egalitarian nature. This is not true of the original democracies, which were strictly classical liberal, where individual liberty was valued, but so were obligations. And they understood that there's no such thing as a right without an obligation. Today, we assume, look at Canada's charter, like I said, we assume you can have all kinds of rights with no corresponding obligations at all. Yet I would defy anyone to name a single right for one that doesn't apply an obligation for another to supply that right, either an individual, a corporation, an institution, or a government. So rights and obligations are two different sides of the same coin. But instead, we're behaving today like a right is some kind of talismanic property that is inherent in you as a human being, like your liver or your heart or your stomach or your brain, you know, and you carry it around all your life and get to express it at will without any worries about having any obligations or creating an obligation for someone else. Like you want a tax benefit, but money's being taken from someone else to give it to you.
Positive rights are the kind of rights that have the obligation on another, but negative rights, for like the right for life, it's a different kind of right that doesn't put any obligation. Can you maybe speak about the difference a little bit?
No, I think you're right. So, for example, the right not to be bothered by the government is a negative right. It basically says, don't touch me, and so on. But it doesn't create a right of action on your part or a positive right. So maybe I should have made that distinction. You're quite correct. So we can have negative rights. But for the most part, in countries like Canada, they're being used to secure something for the rights, so-called rights bearer or rights holder, you know, such as single family support, or free medical care and all that kind of stuff. They're not rights to say, leave me alone. I don't want your free medical care. I don't want any of that stuff. Just stop bothering me. That's a different kind of right. You are correct, I think. So. Until very recently, as I say, cohabitation had amazing legal and tax advantages. It's been fixed up a little bit in Canada now because there was a lot of screaming. The difference now is that, for example, say there's two veterans from Canada's military. They're not homosexuals, but they realize that you can get the benefits of homosexual marriage. So they marry each other to get all the benefits. There's about 80 of them, most of them of a financial nature, some of a legal nature. And they live together in the same apartment, but in separate rooms. They have no sexual interest in each other, but they realize that they can pretend to be homosexuals and get all these benefits. A couple of veterans, you know. They're not ashamed of it. They just say, well, what the hell? It's there. I might as well take it, you know. And what's the state going to do? Is it going to send the sex police into your apartment to see if you're actually, you know, buggering each other or not, or sleeping together, or whatever term they want to use for what it is that they do? It's not going to happen. So this is all part of the breakdown of a reasonable structure that was supportive of the traditional family. So one of the conclusions I come to here, by the way, and people get shocked when I say this, is that in Canada and the USA, it's impossible legally to bind yourself with someone for a lifelong marriage. By all of these measures, rights enthusiasts have succeeded in undermining the whole contractual and sacramental basis for marital union. Harry, I just see that I have a call from the hospital that I have to take. Can I put it on mute and take the call?
Of course. Yes, of course.
Thank you. Give me. We're okay.
We can wait if you need to call them back. Please take your time.
It's okay. It wasn't what I thought, so we're okay. Thank you.
Okay.
And we're getting close to that anyway. In addition, I say by all these measures, rights enthusiasts, not just rights enthusiasts, not sacramental rights, not marital rights, not social rights, but democratic rights enthusiasts have succeeded in undermining the entire contractual and sacramental basis for marital union. And we can thank egalitarian democracy for that, I'm afraid to say. In addition, anyone unfamiliar with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child will be shocked to see how many sections of that document enforce the rights of the individual child against the family and against society. Since children are too young to exercise rights, this means that government officials will have to do so for them. During its year of the family, which I think was, 1996 or something, the United Nations, get this, it's not a joke. The United Nations publicly defined and internationally defined the family as the smallest democracy at the heart of society, unquote, quote unquote. The smallest democracy at the heart of society. I almost did somersaults when I heard that. So I thought, oh boy, we really have to fight against this stuff. This is pure bureaucratic hype and drivel, because the family has never been a democracy, and nor should it be. Just try to imagine a family with 3 children voting against their parents on whether they should go to school or be allowed to burp at the table. You know, the whole thing is insane. But I have to tell you, I went to a meeting of which the UN held in Canada, was in the city of Winnipeg, I think. I went to a meeting. I was invited to a meeting. There were about 20 people in the room. And the woman who was leading the discussion, she had a banner up on the wall with the United Nations logo all over it. And the slogan was, the smallest democracy at the heart of society. And I said, excuse me, I said, the smallest democracy at the heart of society. How do you define that? And she said, well, any group of human beings who love each other, care for each other, support each other, This is what she actually said. I'm taking it out of her mouth. And I looked around the room at the other 19 people and I said, well, would you describe the people in this room as a family? And I give her credit. She paused for a couple of seconds. And then she said, yes. If they care for each other and work for each other, this would be a family. And the whole room started to laugh, which at least she was gracious enough to blush. But that is what the United Nations was putting about, that the family is the smallest democracy at the heart of society. Finally, we have what I call the education radicals. Public school teachers must, of course, act as trustees of our children for someone, either for the parents and their community or for the state. Ultimately, in curricula, teaching philosophy, textbooks chosen, and especially in every aspect of modern sex education, which we've done a lot of videos for here, they clearly tend to side with the state and its officially promulgated views against those of the private family, which they derided as Victorian or bigoted or homophobic, or most damning of all, from the 50s, which they think is the worst thing you could do is cite some idea from the 50s. You're a dinosaur, all that kind of thing. So to conclude, the course for conservative-minded people is clear. We must first understand that a certain amount of classical democracy may be a good thing, but in its radical modern form, it seems to work against the formation of community, and it takes special aim at the natural family, which will always come out as the loser in this war. And that ends my little discussion of this situation, which I have to say has only gotten worse. With the woke movements, it's completely come apart at the seams. And it's interesting because I think where this wokeness thing is going to take these people to is a point where they won't know how to define anything. So look, for example, at these websites and discussions people are having on the web, trying to define what is a woman. Really, what is a woman? Well, I'm a real man and I can tell you what a woman is, but not on the show. But at any rate, that's the kind of discussion people are having. What is a woman? And as I think I mentioned on one of our shows, people like Bruce Jenner, who won the decathlon in 1976, fabulous athlete. He thinks he's Caitlyn Jenner now. And I just don't understand why society has capitulated and is calling him she when they know that he's a he. I think he even has his male parts still. I don't think he cut them off. So he's very much a he. But they go along with the masquerade. And I tell you, any society which is weak enough, frail enough, misbegotten enough, and stupid enough to fall for that and print these kinds of things in its newspapers and speak them on its radio and TV shows as if it was normal, you're in a sinking ship. You're in a sinking ship. And that's what we are on and have been for some time. What's going to bring it around? I don't know, but I think Oswald Spengler has been justified in writing his history book about the decline of the West. So, over to you.
Do you think that this phenomena of cyclical decay is something that happens when in every empire or every civilization that reaches its peak?
Yes, I do. And Spengler talked about that, and we spoke about it mostly, and it's really a great read I recommend to your listeners, along with The Quest for Community book by Robert Nisbet, which I mentioned earlier. That's a must-read. And there's another book by an ancient author named Polybius. He was, I think he was Greek-born, but he ended up being a Roman citizen. And Polybius wrote a short book on political systems. I'm trying to remember the name of it now, the title. But if you look up Polybius, you'll get the title, in which he described what he called anacyclosis. So the word cycle is in there. Anacyclosis is the turning over of states, going from mob rule to dictatorship, to aristocracy, to democracy, to mob rule and around again. This is the kind of cycle. I don't know how accurate I got that, but it's pretty much the cycle that he describes. And one of these will lead to the other. And, the fact is, I never thought I'd be telling my own adult children this, but we are living in a time of the decline, the radical decline of our so-called democratic system. And the irony to me, by the way, is that Canada's own founders and America's own founders did not use the word democracy very often. They were highly suspicious of it, as I say. The American system was constructed to make them into a republic, not a democracy, in which they had checks and balances and what they call filtration of the body politic, which was designed to get the best people into the legislature, not just anybody. They wanted to get the best people into the legislature. So all these checks and balances produced what they called filtration. That's the word they use. You filter the masses, the democratic masses, leave the dregs behind and get the best of them out to do your ruling. So that's the adventure they went with. Canada was watching all this at the time. That was 1787 in the States. Canada's constitution was finalized in 1862. But in the years preceding 1862, the Canadian politicians were watching America. And what were they seeing? A democratic bloodbath, a civil war, which was created by confusions in democratic policy and in democratic notions of rights, individual rights, states' rights, all these kinds of things. There's much public confusion about it still today. And so Canada said, we don't want that. We do not want a republic. We do not want a democracy, although we agree that if we can have a system in which the people more or less give, tacit consent to the laws. They don't have to give direct consent. They're going to choose their own representatives. We're not letting the people vote in the actual legislature. We're not letting them vote on the actual laws. Good heavens, no. But we'll let their representatives vote for their representatives, who will in turn vote on the laws. So that was a way of keeping the laws away from the people, from the level of the dregs, from the fools, as I said, and trying to direct them towards the wise people who were to get into the legislature and make the laws. People would never make the laws or consent to those laws. It wasn't even asked for. And they did not want anything like the Americans had, because they didn't want a civil war, which Canada could easily have had between the English and the French at various times, and between Democrats and monarchists, which we did have. We had a rebellion in 1837 against the Crown of England. And there were a lot of radicals. I happen to be living in a part of Canada where a lot of their radical notions were being formed. And when the monarchy came after them on horseback, they chased them out of Canada and they went to the States, where they would be among Democrats, which is what they wanted for here. So Canada was, just like the U.S., was created in a way which would not encourage pure democracy, you see.
But it failed.
Our Senate is still unelected, and the idea was that you can't have two elected bodies, because then you get a conflict of legitimacies, such as we see in America, where there's always a war between Congress, between the House and the Senate. Always a war between the House and the Senate. It's endless. Canada didn't want that. They wanted the senators to be wise people chosen from the body politic by the government or by the Crown, and they would sit in the Senate. And if they didn't like the laws that the people's representatives were making, they would say, it's not a good law. Take it back and fix it up, and then we'll look at it again. See, so oversight by filtration was the idea. And that's what Canada is today, although despite that, so few people actually know their own history. You hear them all using the word democracy. Canada's a democracy. I want my democratic right. And I turn to them and I say, well, Canada's never been a democracy. Not in the sense that you mean, not at all. So where are you getting that idea from? Well, they're getting it from newspapers and TV and from national notion, which happens to be historically erroneous.
But William, in the end of the day, when you see the results and you look at the beginning of the U.S. as a constitutional republic, and you see how it limited the government and everything, and then you fast forward 250 years and you see what we have today, then obviously the system is demonstrating that it starts small and eventually it turns into the biggest beast the world has ever knew. So it's a problem, and it's part of maybe human nature, or maybe other explanation for that. But when we give people so much power to control society, to indoctrinate the children, to take advantage of the unrestrained behavior, then eventually we will find ourselves all the time in the same situation and worse. So how can we still trust this kind of democratic systems and check and balances when every time the result is just worse?
Well, I think historians would say you can't. You may delay them, you may slow them down a little bit, but it's kind of like a tsunami. It's going to roll over you eventually. History will have its say. That's what Polybius was arguing 2,000 years ago. In a way, he told us what to expect next. A certain amount of chaos. And by the way, it's interesting to me, I think the wealthy people, and there are millions of wealthy people in most of the modern democratic states, wealthy people can ride it down very comfortably. They have their nice cars, they have their European, Italian shoes, French food, whatever. They can ride it down beautifully. They get into gated communities and that kind of thing. I mean, I'm looking for one now. And my wife and I have done fairly well in life. I've been retired for some time. I'm old enough to say, I want to find a gated community where I can buy a little place. And if I die, which is going to happen someday, my wife will be protected. At least there'll be a gate. People won't be able just to drive in. So we have this move towards greater and greater privacy and greater social and economic privilege for the rich who can ride societies down for a long time. I mean, suppose it took 100 years for Canada or Israel, whatever, to really crash, to become unmanageable. You know, the kind of thing we saw in the U.S. last summer with those BML riots and burning police stations and chaos in the streets. Well, that's just the thin edge of the wedge. Once you get an entire population feeling that way, watch out. You know, you won't have enough police ever. And you better live in a gated community or buy yourself a decent rifle, to defend yourself. That is the future long term. I don't think it's here now by a long shot, but we are seeing symptoms of it. And I've been trying to describe these symptoms for 30 years now. I think the breakdown of the natural family is a huge manifestation of social breakdown in general. What's one of the reasons for that? Well, all governments die. All governments end up being corrupted. All governments fail in the long run. The reason for that we have discussed. They get too big, they get unwieldy, they become worlds apart from the citizens they're supposed to rule. But the family is a natural, social, and biological organization, which despite the attacks we've been making on it, sexual, biological, and otherwise, is the only enduring human society which has ever existed. You can find it 1 million years ago, evidence of it, and you can find it everywhere today, much as it's under threat. And I think the first thing that's going to happen when some of these states get under threat physically is people grab onto the family. They run for their loved ones. They protect their parents. They grab their children.
I have a question for you, the last one, and then I will let you go. You know how much I respect you, and you are a man of great honor and morality and intellectual. Do you honestly feel that a man like you should be ruled by others?
Well, I would prefer to rule myself, but I don't know where it would be possible to live without being ruled by others.
But would it be preferable for men like you to actually live a restrained, peaceful life with the respect for the rights of others, negative rights, and for you to be just left alone, doing what you wish for?
Well, I don't want to advertise, but I'm doing that now because I have a certain amount of wealth. So I'm able to insulate myself from most engagements in political life. I don't insulate myself from engagements in civil life. As you can see, that's why we're doing all our videos. I mean, good heavens, I'm almost 82. I've written thousands of pages protesting against this and that, and not just protesting. It's futile just to protest, and recommending better ways to do it. Is anybody listening? Well, you were listening, and maybe some of your people are listening now. So I'm extremely grateful for that. Is it going to make a difference? Well, as I said, I feel like a man standing on a rock in a leftward drifting sea. And in the distance, I hear voices on leftward drifting ships, and they're saying, look, there's a man out there drifting to the right. But I haven't moved. And I think eternal society, if I may be so bold, hasn't moved either. Natural law hasn't moved either. It's the same as it always was. And human nature is the same as it always was. And I don't know if I ever quoted that little piece of doggerel for you that was found in a Chicago newspaper by a wonderful writer. I really have to read this man. His name was Irving Babbitt, 2 B's and 2 T's, Irving Babbitt. He was a wonderful Harvard professor who died in the late 30s, I think. But he found this article in the Chicago Tribune newspaper in 1938, this little bit of poetry we call doggerel, because it's not serious poetry. So it goes like this. So I hold it is not treason to suggest a simple reason for the sorry lack of progress that we decry. It is this, he said. Instead of working on himself, each man is shirking and trying to reform some other guy. In a tiny little poem, that sums up the difficulty with modern progressive societies. These societies are filled to the brim with people we now call social engineers, people who are trying to reform some other guy. They're not like the Buddhist who's trying to reform himself and is so unhappy because he isn't the very good man that he wants to be, but hopes to be someday. Oh no, they're out reforming you, and they're taking your money to do it. And I think this is what has happened to all these modern democracies. We have created these super states. They're almost unmanageable. You can see that because everywhere you look, you see incompetence. Again, people say to me, wouldn't it be great if the government was more efficient? I say, don't pray for that. They're already everywhere in your life. If they were more efficient, you'd be hearing from them every day. Enough is enough. So my answer is I have retreated. I am living in a quiet sort of world. I have a 28-acre property with a small lake on it. My 16 grandkids come over and they swim and have a great time with grandpa and grandma and all that. So we do have a good life. Do I have to pay a lot of taxes for that? Yes. I've written checks to Canada's government for $1 million sometimes, because of transactions that I got involved in. And I was forced to pay taxes I didn't think should be applicable. But they are, and I paid. And my friends would say, well, if you don't like it, why don't you go somewhere else? My answer is there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere you can go where you can escape government. Maybe if you just buy a car with no license plate and drive off somewhere, they won't find you. You'll have to go fishing and hire yourself out for odd farm jobs and all that. But that wouldn't be much of a life, and you certainly wouldn't be raising a family doing it. So I think you're caught by the short and curlies, as they say. And the long answer to your question is you better protect yourself in the best way you can. That's what I have tried to do.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you very much, William. Can you remind us again about, you mentioned earlier about the topic for next week, which one it's going to be?
Well, I would like to talk about the social bonding, the process of social bonding, and why I think it's important. It will be the topic.
Beautiful.
Because, I hinted at it today in my paper, but I'll develop it next week.
Okay. Can you speak a little bit also about the democratic polis, like you mentioned earlier?
The polis?
Yeah, because
I was referring to the Greek name for the city-state.
Yes.
Which is the polis, and
but you made me understand that there are like some characteristics of that which we maybe should preserve or understand if we want something better in the future. So maybe you can speak about that a little.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question, if I could. Are you familiar with my personal page on Epoch Times newspaper?
You sent it to me, and I put it in the group.
Yes. Yeah, and I think I sent you the link. Well, one of the essays that I wrote for them, which I recommend to you and your group here, is called Democracy and the Anti-Polis. I mentioned earlier, this is the anti-polis is a urban structure which in fact militates against the values of the traditional classical polis, in which the good of all was foremost. And by the way, this movement is trying to come back a little bit, because there's a movement in the U.S. You can browse for it and look if you want. It's called Common Good Conservatism. And there's some very vital, interesting arguments going on between various kinds of conservatives themselves and, of course, classical liberals and libertarians. It's a very vital topic at the moment. Perhaps if I learn more about it, we could have a session on that. But it's just risen its head in the last 10, 15 years. It's called Common Good Conservatism, in which these writers and thinkers are trying to bring back what I was just talking with your group about earlier, which is the notion that the common good of all should precede your personal good in almost every way. Perhaps not always, like if you're trying to save yourself from drowning, you're not thinking of the common good, you're just thinking of yourself. But in general, in political life, before you vote, before you make any decisions, the good of all should be foremost. Because what is a human community in which people do not think about the good of all before they act? Well, one of the great critics, as I mentioned before in one of our talks, one of the great critics of John Stuart Mill's harm principle, which is only about individuals, and it's only about harm, it's not about the good. So I don't know why they embrace it so strongly. He said, if you don't have a concept of the common good, it's like a bunch of husky dogs attached to a sled, but not attached to each other. And they're all trying to pull the sled or the wagon in different directions. Okay, the wagon is a metaphor for society, and the dogs are a metaphor for the social forces or individuals all going in different directions. It's the ruination of any notion of society rooted in any common value at all. So I think the common good conservative writers today, do look for them, you'll enjoy them, are arguing vitally for the comeback of this notion.
But the kind of common good that you're talking about is the one that is based on objective morality, not the one that will eventually lead to the extreme altruism of sacrifice, right? No,
that's right. And I think natural law is in the background of all these conservative thinkers.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
And if you want natural law in its best form, you go to Cicero, who first articulated it for us in his lectures. And then you go to Aquinas. Aquinas was a great proponent of the natural law, or what he called synderesis, which is what I'm talking about, this notion of choosing for the good of all and not just yourself. Mm-hmm. You may benefit, but you're not just thinking about only you benefiting.
Yeah, I understand. Maybe if you don't mind, someday in the future, you can create a list of recommendations for a reading book. A list of books that you recommend for us to read, so we can inform ourselves better.
I will for sure. There's all kinds of wonderful books I'll recommend for you, and it'd be a delight to do it.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this amazing presentation as usual. And we will be seeing you next week, next Wednesday.
Thank you for having me again.
Thank you. I will send you the recording privately and in the main group in about 2 minutes. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a beautiful day.